Let's talk for and about the LGBT communities around the world. I'm Michael Ross, and this is Straight Friendly. In this episode, we will be talking with one of my most favorite podcasters about queer history in the United States of America. Did you know that the United States is the third biggest country in the world, just after China and India? It seems like all LGBT people in the world are located in the States, but yet they resemble only 4.2% of the LGBT communities around the world. Before we proceed to our guest, I would like to note that the production of this episode came to reality thanks to the support of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom in Jerusalem. And also thanks to our team, Jonathan El-Khoury and Sharon Egri. He is the creator and host of a long-running interview podcast, LGBTQ&A, recommended by the New York Times. Guests include Pete Buttigieg, Laverne Cox, Melissa Etheridge, Senator Tammy Baldwin, and over 200 guests. He is a GLAAD Media Award-winning journalist and has also appeared on MSNBC and NPR. Please welcome the legendary Jeffrey Masters. Hello.
Hi, Michael. Thank you.
So for me, it's a huge pleasure. Your podcast is one of my favorite podcasts, and I must say that before starting this podcast, I was doing it in my mother language in Hebrew in Israel. And many times when I was talking about events happening in the US, like Stonewall riots, for instance, and I wanted to find more information, so your podcast was actually one of my resources. So now we finally also meet in an episode on my podcast. So great pleasure having you here.
Oh, that means a lot to me. Those are like the older interviews too. The older guests are like my favorites. So I'm glad to hear that for sure.
Before talking about the USA, and I think that for many of us, once starting reading about LGBTQ history, also in other countries all around the world, and once starting reading about the history, many times it either starts with the ancient times or it starts with the modern times. Many times it starts with Stonewall and other events like the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, which we will be talking about. So many times for people, it seems like the things are happening in the United States. And I think that in this episode, we probably will not be able to talk about everything happening in the US, since the culture there, the queer culture, is so rich. It has so much of it. So I can definitely understand how you can have a whole huge podcast talking about the different stuff happening in the United States, and I'm learning a lot. Many of the things which are happening in the States are not even happening, for instance, in my country, where the rights towards the community are progressing more and more. And I think the situation is, let's say, it's not perfect, but it's better than in other places around the world. But like for me, it's also like, it's so inspiring. You know, I just presented now you and your podcast, and even like an organization which is GLAAD. And I think that like in my country, there is nothing like GLAAD. So my first question for you would be that what made you to do your own podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I started this like 5-6 years ago when I was still explaining what a podcast was, right? And so like the market's changed in that sense in a really quick way. But back then I felt like nobody was recording modern queer history, right? We have so many, and also all in one place. I think that's really powerful too. So we have all these amazing figures from history that are still alive today. And you know, like it still sounds crazy to say, but 5 years ago was a pretty different time. You know, I could name every single trans person on TV because there was 3. You know, I watched every show with a gay character because there was 4. And now we are across like, you know, every network, almost like every channel, all these things. But back then I just felt like there was not enough queer content, and they were not showing like the breadth of our community too. And when I say like diversity, I mean like racial, but also, religion, socioeconomic status, geography, age diversity is really important to me. And so I wanted to capture the community from every different angle.
So basically you started with your podcast, if I remember correct, on 2017, right?
It's been, I think 2016. We had our 5-year anniversary last month.
Okay. So congratulations for that.
Thank you. We're 5. Oh my God.
You are our big brother or mother because we started 2 years ago. But so you were definitely one of the pioneers in terms of that field. Was there anything specific that happened around those years that made you to do your podcast? Was there any special event?
Are you saying in my life or like in the world?
In your life or in the world that affected your life? You probably had to find yourself one day waking up saying yourself, okay, that's it. I decided I'm doing this thing. I'm doing this podcast, although I don't know maybe if it can work or not because there are not so many things like that happening back then.
Yeah, it was less of like a light switch that just turned on and off and more like a slow fade. So I was doing different like reporting and like on-air reporting and like red carpets. And I find that being a red carpet reporter is just like the most mind-numbing thing possible. You're standing there shouting at celebrities, trying to like stick your microphone in their face, asking them like 2 questions. And they're like, well, it's been 10 seconds. Like I got to move to the next person on the red carpet. And that's what you do when you're in Hollywood in your 20s, when you're like a young person starting out. So then I found long form interviews, and I'm a big reader. And so I just started interviewing authors. And so talking to them for 45 minutes, an hour, these people that have been reading for 10 years was so just exciting to me. And then I realized that it was amazing training interviewing authors, and I still do it all the time on my show, but no one really is a reader in the world. No one cares about books as much as I do. Like that was never going to like take off. And so at that time I'd fall in love with podcasts, and I was looking for a queer interview podcast, and they did exist. Absolutely. This is not the first, I'm not the first person to say, let's interview gay people. Oh my God, like a brilliant idea. But they just weren't covering the scope of the community I wanted or doing exactly what I wanted. And I figured, all right, this is not an original idea, interviewing queer people. So if I don't do it, someone else will. So I said, let's do it now.
Probably before getting to the podcast, I think that this story is really interesting. So you had some information before that, and then you decided to get it more professional, more private conversation about those stuff. Is there any one surprise that you can share us with, let's say, some information that you knew before, but then you found something different when interviewing that person?
I think that everybody surprises me. And I think that is like what makes the interviews good, right? If I'm going into each interview to learn something, not to like have them tell the same exact stories each time. And I think that's like why you like want to listen to the show. But I mean, it's been 200 interviews by now. I think I'm just surprised by how different each story is. I think if we were just like a coming out podcast, like that would be so boring. You tell your parents, you told your friends, maybe you told your friends, then you tell your parents. And after 3 interviews, you're like, oh God, like they're telling the exact same story. And so I purposely stay away from those. But I think one of the things that surprises me is like how hard it is to like talk about like common themes throughout everybody, because we do span every location on earth, every like socioeconomic status. Our lives are so crazy different. Whereas maybe 50 years ago, there was like common themes of like loneliness and oppression and that kind of thing. That still exists, of course, but now it's really hard to paint a really specific common thread between everybody in a way that I find like consistently fascinating.
And I think talking about 50 years ago, one of the episodes which you produced and hosted, and I really, really loved, It was an interview or a conversation. I know you call it interviews or conversations. How is it on LGBTQ&A?
I change all the time. I like to call it a conversation because it sounds like more informal. Sometimes I feel like we can like lead in this like didactic territory, and I don't want to feel like they're boring, you know? So I think like a conversation is lovely. Also, though, if you say interview, I'm not going to yell.
It's a discussion.
Yeah.
It's a discussion between friends. So one of the discussions which you had was with Mark Allen Segel. I hope I'm pronouncing the names correct. And before later we'll also play some part of that episode which you had with him and the conversation. Do you want me to present Mark or you present it?
I can, yeah. I think that Mark is completely fascinating in the sense that during his time, he was like one of the most visible and famous gay men in the United States. And now he's somebody that we don't really remember. I remember him. I've interviewed him. But like, you know, you say the name Mark Siegel to people and they don't know who that is. And that's not good or bad. That's just like how our history works, right? People ebb and flow. But Mark was 16 or 17 years old, living in New York City in 1969. He was at the Stonewall Inn when the uprising began. And that really kicked him off to like this lifetime of activism. And he did so much, but he also then, as becoming like a very visible activist who interrupted like live television shows, like the big news anchor, but like back then, like everyone watched the same news show, they would interrupt him. And he kind of segued to this like this tour of different TV shows, like this like publicity tour. And he was one of the very first like
in which years
open gay.
It happened? In what years did it happen?
The 70s.
In the 70s, so just a few years after the Stonewall riots themselves.
Yeah, so like Walter Cronkite, like that at that point where like, you know, half the country watched this like one news station. He did this like tour. And it was like radical to see a gay man who could like talk and was open about it on TV, in your home. And also he was not ashamed of it, right? They would like be throwing these like Bible quotes at them. In the United States, you know, we love our Bible. I'm Jewish, but you know, they'll throw a Bible verse at you. And he was like, that's not true. Like, I don't care. Like, there's nothing to be ashamed of. And to have that, you know, in the 70s in the US on TV was just kind of mind blowing for that time.
For today, things like that are happening and we can see people talking on TV about those issues. But I think that one of the most interesting things related to our history is the fact that it was always there. Maybe the definitions have changed and stuff, but also like the terms, like the term LGBT is quite new. It's like started in the previous century. So in terms of history, like a long time history, it like almost happened yesterday in some way.
Yeah.
And yet he was a pioneer.
We've been a part of like every culture in every world, right? Since the beginning of time. It's like kind of like redundant to say that, but like just we have like an issue in the community now, like placing labels on people who did not use those labels. So, you know, famous examples like, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln, like the president of the United States, had like a documented relationship with a man. They shared the bed. It was a former vice president, and they had this relationship. Like, was it sexual? I don't know. But like, would he have used the word bisexual? No, that's a new term. And so like, do we get to claim him as like a member of the community? I think like there's an argument to be made for both ways of that.
I actually, until now, I had no idea about the story of Abraham Lincoln. So you see, every day you learn a new thing about our culture or stories of...
Yeah, I mean, some of the most like beautiful like love letters ever read were from Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, writing to a female journalist. And they just had like a documented relationship where, you know, it would be like Christmas. And she's like, I'm so mad that I'm waking up and you're not here to celebrate Christmas with me. And she's like, I'm holding the ring that you sent me just to remind me of you, to like be back in your presence. It's just like beautiful words of prose where, again, Eleanor Roosevelt didn't label her sexuality, but she also didn't hide it per se from history. Let's say that, like with like these documented love letters to Lorena Hickok, who was a reporter for the New York Times.
Before I move to my next question, I can already say what my question would be. My question would be, what was so unique about the Stonewall riots, what happened there, what changed our life. But before you'll answer the question, I think that it's the right time for us to listen to that part of your podcast, interviewing Mark Ellen Segal that was in those riots.
Right from the beginning, we started organizing. That includes from the street, writing on the street tomorrow night, to the third or fourth or fifth night, I don't remember which, where we had leaflets on the street saying, we're not going to allow the police to oppress us anymore. This is our neighborhood. That's what is so revolutionary. That was in itself illegal. When we gathered at the steps of Stonewall, that was illegal. Homosexuals could not congregate together. That was illegal. When we said we were going to fight the police, that was illegal. Everything we did in that first year was basically illegal, and we wouldn't be stopped. We were going to be out, loud, proud, and don't even try to stop us.
One of the things I love about that clip is that, he's explaining Stonewall, but this is a uprising that lasted, 3 days, 4 days. There's like different discrepancies there, but it lasted a number of days. And I love that it was, purposeful. It wasn't just like a fire. It wasn't like Hanukkah where the candle burned for 8 days, right? This was like something we continued to keep lighting to make sure it lasted for those 3 or 4 days by forcing the issue and making it to be a big event, purposefully to show our power. And so him writing with chalk along the streets of the West Village, meet at Stonewall tonight, 5 p.m., that dispensing of information to me, that's the modern day tweeting, right? Meet here tonight. It's a small phrase, 140 characters. And just I love the thoughtfulness of this is a big deal. Let's make it an even bigger deal to show something.
Was it a really big deal compared to other events happened? Because I know that there were also some kind of riots that took place a few decades before that in the US, I think in the 30s, something like that. What happened?
Yeah, it definitely was not the first one, but I mean, the different things of different importance too, for sure. But I think that when it came to Stonewall, it was a big deal in terms of scale, for sure. But I think it's a big deal by what came after it, what it kicked off. It launched these different gay organizations. It really mobilized us to form a community. Back then, the semblance of a queer community, it wasn't a concept that people had. There was no. Was not a thing that existed. So Stonewall kind of showed us, we need to band together to fight back. And these early gay organizations, they were activist groups who had different policy agendas they wanted enacted, but a large portion of their activism was community building, hosting safe parties and stuff where you could come and meet other gay men and not just only have a purely sexual relationship, or you could form a lifelong friendship. And that was new. Stonewall also really merged our movements with queer women. Back then, it was kind of gay men and lesbians, and trans wasn't really even a word back then. But really it showed us that we need to work together with women because we have a common goal. And so but I think that Stonewall was important, but it was everything that it inspired to follow that changed our movement.
One of the discussions which I hear among the activists around me those days, decades after, there are lots of questions and discussions about who were the people who started the riots. Because today there are different movies and TV series where we can see there was the movie about Stonewall on Netflix. There's also the story of the death and life of Marsha P. Johnson. And today we have also Pose. Later we'll also talk about the ball scene. But from what we hear here, meaning outside of the US, or at least in Israel, are lots of questions of where the people who spread, there's one, I don't know if it's a myth or an evidence that Marsha P. Johnson, she threw a glass in the bar. I don't know if it's true or not. And one of the things which is being said is that there is a differentiation between the people who were in Stonewall and the people who were leading the organizations, which now we understand that they started to unite together, those organizations, right after the riots. But what do you know about that?
Yeah. So I think that when it comes to like who started it, we don't have that specific information. I also don't know if that actually matters, right? I do know that our community for so long has been undocumented, right? A lot of like just queer history wasn't written about. We learn about World War II, and we don't learn that like Alan Turing, a gay man, like invented the Enigma to like break the codes to like help speed up the end of the war. We learn about him, but not that he's gay. And when it comes to queer history, like Marsha P. Johnson herself has said that she was not at Stonewall, but we love the myth that she started it because it helps to like kind of tell the stories of like the modern movement too. It helps to remind us to like center trans people. Does it actually matter that she didn't throw the first brick? That was there even a first brick? These are questions. I think that like the mythology is really important for a community that doesn't have a lot of recorded history, but we have like the first brick, the first punch with Stormy DeLavier, like the first, etc. The people who were there, this is not a nice bar, right? It was run by the mafia. Mark Siegel, I think, calls himself like a street kid, which meant that he was like a teenager wearing like dirty clothes. And the people who had like had nothing to lose were the ones who like continued making Stonewall like into Stonewall, right? The people, if you were a man with a great job, maybe you weren't at Stonewall to begin with, but if you were, when the police broke out, you ran away because you were going to get fired from your job if they found out you were gay. You could have lost your family, your friends. Being a gay man back then was like a profoundly marginalized community. And so the people who stayed and fought back were the people with nothing to lose. It was the kids. It was the like street youth and people like that. Also, people came throughout the night also. I think Sylvia Rivera, who's like an icon from trans history, she said that she heard what was going on at Stonewall and that like maybe like she like went by to see what was going on, but like she wasn't a part of it. And also people change their stories. So in later years, she also said, I wasn't there, but as Stonewall grew in prominence, she said, no, I was there. So did Marsha throw this first brick? Probably not. But I think like that's okay,
It's just like in any culture, or maybe most of the cultures, that there's like, you said the Bible, but it's like that sometimes there's like a kind of a need for a story, and our story, maybe we're still creating it. That story.
And also like, stories are important too, like for something just to like grasp onto from history, but also like these things gets distorted, right? Where I think that like there's a common thing in like at least the American queer community of like, how dare you not know that trans women started Stonewall? And that's not like maybe factually true that they did, but like, I don't know what I'm saying, but I think that like we distort history, and that's just kind of like how things work.
Yeah, and also giving that place, like the fact that someone said that, like, as you said, didn't you know that the trans? Because maybe sometimes we are looking for characters that we can identify with, because that story, those other stories, are part of our identity, apparently.
Yeah, and these characters are important too. I don't want to sound like I'm like denigrating trans people, but when I was in Tel Aviv, I think 2 or 3 years ago, I was amazed seeing, I think it was a LGBT center. It was like a mural with Stonewall and with Marsha and Sylvia. And the fact that like their stories and these characters have transcended borders to make it all the way to Israel, like kind of blew me away.
By the way, it's quite new. That's why I asked about it, because here it feels like there is some change. At least in my country and with other activists I talk with, many from Europe, there's a feeling that something is changing among the activists. For instance, like in the 90s, the discussion, a lot of it was about like, should artists and politicians and known figures, should they come outside of the closet or not? And in my feeling, I think it's just that like in some way we moved forward, we made one more step that maybe now our activism and the subjects that we care about can get more into the details, can ask those questions of...
Yeah.
different.
I think too, like the difference between the queer community in Israel and America, like more broadly, I think are like fascinating. You know, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the biggest like demonstration, like gathering of people to protest for the queer community in Israel was over surrogacy, right? Was that a couple of years ago?
Correct, yes.
And so that is fascinating to me because that would not draw a crowd in the US. And I use that as an example because the queer community here is really, they rail against heteronormativity, like this like desire to like assimilate and have like a 2-person household, you know, like kids on the table, like a Friday night Shabbat, things like that, where like we are all about kind of like remaking societies, saying like these are arbitrary rules that, you know, we don't need to fall into. And you have your 2-person household. We don't want that. And surrogacy, I think, is important for people who want it. It's incredible. Like I might want it one day, but that would not draw a crowd like it did in Israel. So I found that so interesting, and like just like what the different goals and priorities are.
I didn't think about it until you said it, you know, because for me it's like, of course it is, but if trying now to take a step back, like to look at it from another point of view. So yeah, in my culture, the whole idea of family, of having a family, is one of the main parts of culture.
Yeah.
I was very active in that protest, and I was holding some sign. It got to some newspapers and stuff, and I wrote there that like the sense of the Israeli government is that he, meaning me, can hold a gun, meaning can make the mandatory service, which is value number 1 in the Jewish society in Israel, and number 2 is about the family. So like he can hold a gun, but he cannot hold a stroller. Yeah. And for me, it seemed to be like very obvious. I now understand it more and more, but it's not that obvious in other cultures. I think that what was interesting about that protest that happened in Israel, I think it was around 2018, is the fact that it was maybe one of the first big protests which was relevant not only for people who live in big cities like Tel Aviv, and it was about some values that also people who are not necessarily from the LGBT community could, or the queer community, and should that they could affiliate with. I know so many straight people.
That's such a great point. That's such a great point because you're telling the rest of the non-queer community in Israel, hey, you have these values for community, and like we want that too. We value what you value, and they're able to then like march with you. But if you are asking for other things that they don't value, like that makes it a harder sell. Where like they're probably not going to like show up to like march with you.
I think that's why
it's the same reason why like marriage equality like passed here really quickly, right? Or not really quickly, but it passed here faster than other things. Because we're telling straight people like we have the same values, and we also reframe the debate as being about love. And that makes it really hard to disagree with. Like, these people love each other. Shouldn't they be able to get married? As opposed to like, hey, your state still has sodomy laws on the books, or it's illegal for 2 consenting adults to have like anal sex in the privacy of their home. Shouldn't we strike that down? And people might go, oh, you're talking about sex. It makes me uncomfortable. Like, I don't know. But when it's about love, like, oh my God, love. It's like, yes, of course. Love is love. Like, how could I disagree?
I so much agree. Yeah, I mean, like maybe it's easier to unite about values like love, something which everyone can agree with. Our next topic, the ball culture, and the ball scene, or cultures to say, because there are so many cultures around it, and I think it continues our discussion because there's a question in our cultures and movements, and maybe also the future activism. I think that sometimes it goes somewhere back and forth around the questions of, do we want to assimilate? Do we want to be like the others, like the heteronormatives, let's say? Like, do we want to be straight friendly? Or we want to differentiate ourselves, you know? And I think that maybe the ball culture, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I would love you also to explain a bit about it. I'm so much inspired by the ball culture, and I think that in some way maybe there were like those cultures of the ball scenes and the houses and the mothers. In some way they could see the future, or maybe like the underground culture is now more vivid in the mainstream culture and affecting other underground cultures. And I mean about like going back and forth with those questions. I think that the ball culture was dealing with it. But okay, I was talking too much about the ball culture, but Jeffrey, can you please explain us, to those of us who don't know what it is, and what is the ball culture? Do you vogue, by the way? Do you do voguing?
I do not. I'm not an expert in ballroom by any means, and I do not vogue. The ballroom scene in the U.S.
I have to admit.
Excuse me?
I do sometimes.
You what?
When
You
no one
do?
is
Oh my
watching.
God.
I'm trying.
If this wasn't an audio-only medium, I would ask you to do it. So you're off the hook this time.
I'm safe this time. It's better for us not to see me dancing here, but yeah.
Okay. But yeah, so I'm definitely not an expert in ballroom, but it's in the U.S. It primarily is a community of people of color, primarily queer, lots of trans folks, and it's a way to, I mean, honestly, it's like a way to gather and like form community. These are folks that are historically not as accepted, as welcome in like what we call like more like mainstream queer spaces, let's say like a gay bar, this and that. Or maybe they're not even welcome in their own homes, right? So it's a way to like form literal families to compete and gather and, you know, like dance and walk and all these things. And it is like the community for so many people in the U.S., primarily bigger cities, I think. You'll find the ballroom, New York, Atlanta, LA, but location-wise, I think it's usually bigger cities.
I think talking about also myths, I have some myth in my head that imagining that the people who maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, yeah. I have also my own myths. You know, history in our stories, it's like sometimes it's really difficult to know what has happened and what has not, since lots of it has not been documented. But in some way, you know, many times I imagine that like the street people who found themselves in the streets, either because being part of it, being queer or not, I imagine that many times that those the people that probably had nothing to lose in the different riots that happened, like Stonewall, for instance, and other events. And like many times I imagine that these are the people who were part of those houses that were formed.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely overlap for sure. Yeah, definitely. Wait, so in your when you say like myths, are you saying like the myth or the assumption is that like everybody in America is like a part of the ballroom scene and like does voguing?
No, not at all. I think it seems to be like a very underground thing. But you know, it's like really interesting. Even the way I found out about that, I was lucky enough to spend one semester in New York. And then a friend of mine there, who is not from the community, while we were walking there in the streets, she told me about the voguing scene. And she asked me, do you know about Madonna and her song Vogue? And I said, of course, it's like one of my most favorite songs ever, and it's Madonna. And then she told me, it's interesting actually how I found out about that. That's way before Pose and, you know, that TV program. And also RuPaul's Drag Race, which like these days, many people know what it is. Although I have to say, a few days ago, I asked a friend of mine, like she said something and I wrote her back something like, and may the best woman win, as RuPaul says. And she asked me who RuPaul is. But so sometimes things like that still happen, but we will make sure that
of course
they will not. No, just kidding. But like today, there's so much talk and discussion about the ball scene and about voguing and Pose happened. Like, what happened? Why suddenly it's like a subject that so many decades after people are dealing with? or find it interesting?
I think that because we're finally seeing, I think that like when it comes to like Drag Race, like they've taken so much of their DNA from the ballroom scene, but also like the documentary Paris is Burning that, you know, focuses on the ball scene in New York and these communities. And so much of modern queer like language and like vocabulary comes from this space, like specifically Paris is Burning. If you were to watch that now, all queer and trans people talk exactly the way we talk. They talk about throwing shade and all these things like that. And now that's just kind of like mainstream vocab. But really, it all stemmed from this community, a lot from this documentary. I think it would blow people away. So I think that why are we hearing about it now? I think that we're finally kind of hearing about it as a way to give credit to like where credit is due, right? We're finally acknowledging that this is a big part of the queer community, and like here is like where the DNA comes from.
Wow. I think that also what is so interesting is like, from what I know, correct me if I'm wrong, like probably, and again, things are not documented. Like I tried to find out if there was voguing scene in my country decades ago. I asked historians about it also in my Hebrew podcast, and it seems like there are no evidences for that. But from what I know, it's like started in the US, in New York, around the 60s, right? Something like that.
Well, I would be, that's, I don't know when it started, but it was definitely around in the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. I would personally be shocked if it did exist in your country, just because, I mean, I could be wrong. Wasn't it mainly like Europeans, like Eastern Europeans who like were like the first Israelis? Or did I make that up?
Let's not get into the Israeli-Palestinian issues.
No. I didn't mention Palestine. I mentioned early Israelis.
It's complicated. But
okay. So I guess to my point is like the early Israelis who were there, like the very like first place. This was not coming
like
from
the Middle
cultures with ball
Easterns,
scenes.
like the Middle Easterns.
They were not coming from places where ball existed, so it would be very shocking to me if it did.
I guess the Pharaonites in the pyramid, they were not voguing on top of the pyramids.
As much as I know, for sure.
But who knows? Maybe they did, and we don't have evidence for that.
Look at the hieroglyphics. It looks like voguing to me.
So what we do know for sure that it happened some decades ago, or maybe even way before, who knows. But and now people are talking about it more and more and more, and I think it's a good time for us also to listen to another example that you had in your podcast.
Awesome.
With Amaya Scott, where you were talking also about voguing these days.
I think what makes balls so special is that though they're walking back and forth, it's the presentation, and that comes from us like celebrating ourselves. That's what that walking back and forth is. Balls, I believe, but balls were created to not only be a safe space, but to celebrate the community because we weren't being celebrated. So we decided to celebrate ourselves. See what I mean? So you come out and it may not be much. And that's why I love the TV show Pose, because they kind of break that down, especially within the older days. But yes, the balls were like a celebration. Put on your best and let's feel good about ourselves. Let's award ourselves. Let's clap for each other and uplift each other.
I think that what is really interesting about what Amaya said is like, you know, the empowerment. Like it's showing something, you know, being proud of. If we've talked before about Stonewall, it was about demonstrating and show what we are revolting for. Something which is really beautiful about the voguing and the ball culture is it's something that like so much about being brave and proud of who we are. You know, it's like it's a strong culture.
I think that's such a great point because, you know, the trans experience in America has a lot of challenges, and this is one place where, you know, your identity is celebrated. You know, they're literally applauding you as you walk down the aisle, and it's huge.
You know, Jeffrey, I have my own theory, another theory which I want to check with you.
I love theories. Let's do it.
So theory number one, I think that it's maybe because of RuPaul's Drag Race, you know?
You think what is?
the fact that suddenly we see more and more people talking last year's about voguing and practicing it even.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, you agree with me?
Yeah, I think
Fury
that,
One
there's
approved.
TV shows. Yeah, of course. I mean, I think like TV shows like Pose and Legendary on HBO who deal with this culture. I think part of that pitch process for them to get those shows greenlit is them saying, like, look at how influential and successful RuPaul's Drag Race is. That has pulled so many of the ideas from our culture. Let's now highlight exactly our culture and not just this like not watered down version, but this like the different version. Like, let's go back to the original source. I think that's a component for sure.
Wow, I feel so much better now. If you confirm that theory, it's not only RuPaul, but a few years ago, before I started my own podcast and lectures, I went for several months to Mexico, and I was writing some of my things there about LGBT culture, queer cultures. I had once a lecturer said that it's not good to say culture, but we should say cultures. So I'm trying to say cultures, and not identity, but identities, because there's so many of it. There's not one.
Yeah.
So when I was in Mexico, I traveled there around the area of Yucatan and went to Mexico City, and it was actually a few years after I discovered New York City. And for me, I was shocked. There were so many things I found out there. First of all, like I went to some guided tour where we were walking through the pyramids, and we discovered that before the Inquisition time, there were different queer cultures there, which has evidence. It's really like archaeological evidence for. And also I was really amazed by the number of bars where you could go and the variety which it has, which is so big. I have no idea what happened there after COVID. For me, as a person traveling around the world, what I see that many times, many of those bars get shut down, maybe because of Grindr.
Yeah.
Talking about theories and stuff which affect our culture. Do you feel the same, by the way?
That it's Grindr's fault?
Or dating apps that I remember, Jeffrey, like 10 years ago, when I was 12, okay, not. But like 10 years ago, when I was finishing my teenage years, and when I was 20 years old, and I remember even like in Tel Aviv, once going out, there were so many more gay bars to go to. And I feel so with some of my friends in other countries, they feel the same. In Mexico, it was a bit different. Is it the same in the States, you think?
To a certain extent. I think that as queer people become more accepted overall, the gay bars in their mind feel less important because now I can go buy a beer in any bar in the city I want. That being said, I think that like gay bars offer something extremely important for sure. But I think that like that ebb and flow of like a bar's opening and closing is unfortunately just how like the world works for certain.
So like the world is changing. It's not only in our communities.
Yeah. But I think that you do have a great point though with apps, dating apps, hookup apps. People sit at bars now scrolling through their phones to meet the guy next to them who's also scrolling their phone, as opposed to like talking to people. And so these bars do feel less vital in that sense, where maybe 10 years ago to meet another gay person, I had to go to these spaces, and now it's not a requirement.
Maybe this can lead us to theory number 3, which I'm now...
Lay it on me.
Could it be maybe that also that the ball scene is becoming more popular is the fact that the way it's like the people are standing there, like there's a runway in the middle and the people must see each other? You cannot really hide into your phone. It's a too complicated theory, maybe.
I don't think that the ball scene is getting drastically more popular. I don't think they're getting like crowded bars. I think that we're just like hearing about it more, to be honest.
So actually, what I saw in Mexico, I forgot I was talking about Mexico. So what I saw a few years ago in Mexico, and now I'm seeing it more in my country, and I heard it's also happening in Russia. I don't know what's happening in other places. But while I was traveling in Mexico City, I got connected with few local real mothers with houses. And like, let's say like in Israel, for instance, in the last year or two, there's suddenly people doing voguing in the kind of parties or events around that. It's really new here. And I think it's really interesting. I thought that something like that might happen. I wonder if it's just fashion or it's something, maybe this is like the new kind of way for people to celebrate, maybe. But let's say like in Israel, I've noticed that most of the people who were in that ball, they were actually professional dancers. It was not necessarily about the origins of culture, about like the unrepresented people and also like what the moves of the voguing means and about the repression and the strength people could find about it somehow became, just like a dance, like a Zumba or something like that, or yoga that became a fashion. But in Mexico City, what was really interesting for me that I met real mothers, like real people who gathered around themselves other queer people who found themselves in the streets. Later also real professional dancers, so people who joined that. I think it's one of the first times ever I talk about it. I'm not sure what I'm thinking about, but I was wondering what is, your opinion about that, or what do you feel from your experience?
About the dancing?
About like the whole voguing culture. Because for me, sometimes it seems like maybe this is the next thing. Like maybe in the past, it was maybe more about bars, and then it maybe moved to the dating apps, and maybe the new thing could be those. Or you're saying it's not that popular in the US?
It's, let me figure out how to phrase this. Ballroom in the US, it's not widespread. It's not everywhere. It's not easy to find per se. But I also think that anyone is welcome at these balls. However, it really is a person of color like centered space. A lot of people of color, a lot of trans people. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't feel welcome there, but I do think that there are certain benefits. I think that they want to keep it that way because it's for them. It's for their community. I don't think that they want to ever like be at a ball where like it's primarily white people and they're being outnumbered. I think that it's okay to have certain spaces that are just like not for you, and I'm okay with that. There's like different parties here that are. Like Poppy Juice in the Brooklyn is like a really famous party. So it's amazing. And it really caters more towards people of color. And I think that there are so many spaces that cater only to white people that it is important to have spaces for different groups as well. And so like, I'm okay not going to this one amazing party. That is kind of like my feeling about voguing too, where I don't think that they want it to be like gentrified and like assimilated everywhere too. And it's never going to be something that you can find at every corner. But when it comes to like the popularity, I think that I don't see it like taking over the world per se.
I think that in this episode, we had so many different subjects. We started with the story of your podcast and the reasons for you to start it, and you found yourself with over 200 episodes and guests that you had. And from there,
I found myself. You make it sound easy. My God,
I'm sure it's not easy. I'm after 30 episodes. I'm already like, wow, it's so much work. It is so much work. But I can already tell you that it has an effect because I was using that as a resource for my podcast, for the Hebrew one. Also, the episode which we are recording now, who knows where it will go to. And it's so cool that we can record online because, like, I'm saying, in Haifa in Israel, and where are you now?
I'm in New York City. I'm in Hell's Kitchen at the moment.
In Hell's Kitchen, where all the things happen. Oh, you know where to be, Jeffrey. Okay. Next time you visit in my country, I'll show you the local Hell's Kitchen. And some
Deal. I want that. Good.
So, Jeffrey, I want to thank you very, very, very much. It was a big pleasure for me. I really, really enjoyed
Thanks.
that. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity maybe in the future to record, really face to face,
I would love that.
Where I can a bit show you my very poor voguing skills.
I can't wait.
What will you show me if I'll show you my voguing?
That's a secret.
Okay. Anyway, Jeffrey Masters, the host and producers of the LGBTQ&A podcast. Once again, thank you so much. And I'm really recommending you all to find Jeffrey's podcast. Where can people find your podcast?
It's everywhere. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, every platform.
And also you have a wonderful newsletter, which I'm subscribed to, where you can find all the information about each episode.
Yeah, thank you. That's I don't know how people find it, but they can go to my website and find it.
Okay, just Google Jeffrey's name.
Yeah, Google me.
Yeah, you're definitely working really hard. I'm not doing this kind of emails. Not yet. And you have so many episodes. Anyway, Jeffrey, once again, thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you.
This was another episode of Straight Friendly Global. You can find more episodes and listen to our podcast on your favorite listening app, such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Echo Podcasts, Alexa Media Player, Google Podcasts, and so on.